Tokyo, a city of bright lights, endless motion, and shadows lurking in its darkest corners. One such place is an old, abandoned house in the Setagaya district. No one speaks of it aloud. The locals avoid even glancing at its dark, mold-covered walls. Once, a family lived there, a man, his wife, and their young son. But one day, it all ended in a massacre. They say the man lost his mind and killed everyone in a horrific fit of rage before taking his own life. Yet their bodies were never found. Only the blood remained, a sticky black stain on the wooden floor, refusing to fade even after years of abandonment. Since then, anyone who stepped inside that house never returned. Some vanished without a trace. Others were found, but their bodies were twisted into unnatural positions, their eyes wide open in terror, faces frozen in the grimace of deathly fear. Yet not all are deterred by such stories. Some enjoy tempting fate. Tonight, 3 of them entered the house. Ryu, a thrill-seeking blogger, eager to film a video for his channel. Saori, his friend, who didn't believe in ghosts and thought it was all childish nonsense. Tomo, a mutual acquaintance who had heard the legends but remained silent, tagging along for the ride. They crossed the threshold at midnight, unaware that from this moment on their lives were no longer their own. And somewhere in the darkness, in an old dust-filled corridor, something stirred. It knew it was waiting. As Ryu, Saori, and Tomo stepped over the threshold, they were swallowed by a thick, oppressive silence. The flashlight in Ryu's hand trembled, casting a flickering glow on the cracked walls. The air was filled with the scent of dust, rot, and something else, something bitter, metallic. "Well, guys," Ryu grinned, pulling out his camera. "Are you ready to go down in history as the ones who proved all these stories are just myths?" "Just record," Saori muttered, glancing around nervously. Her voice echoed into the emptiness. Tomo remained silent. He felt something was wrong, as if the air itself was thicker, clinging to his skin, as if something unseen was gliding past, brushing against him, only to vanish the moment he turned to look. Ryu switched on the camera. The red light blinked to life, and the lens slowly panned across the room. A broken table in the center, an old futon, crumpled, as if someone had just been lying on it. "That's strange," Saori murmured. "Has someone been living here?" "Impossible," Ryu scoffed. "This house has been sealed for 20 years. But Tomo wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on something in the corner of the room, something dark, something that had just moved. "There's someone there," he whispered. Saori and Ryu snapped their heads in the same direction, but there was only a wall covered in old, moldy stains. "Ha, very funny, Tomo," Ryu scoffed. But Tomo wasn't joking. He could feel it, breathing, faint, cold, barely perceptible. Saori sighed, shrugging. "Let's just hurry up and look around so we can leave." They moved deeper into the house, stepping into a long hallway that felt longer than it should have been. Doors lined both sides, some sealed shut, others covered with ancient talismans, their edges cracked and curling with age. Ryu couldn't ignore the creeping cold settling into his bones, the way his camera felt heavier in his hands. He lifted it to his face, checking the frame, and then he saw her, a woman in a white shirt, standing at the end of the hallway behind them. Her face was hidden beneath long black hair, but Ryu knew She was staring right at him. He froze. "Ryu, what's wrong?" Saori asked. "Do you see that?" They turned. The hallway was empty. Ryu slowly lowered the camera. His hands were shaking. He didn't want to look through the viewfinder again, but when he lifted his gaze, he realized the door ahead of them, the one that had been tightly shut just seconds ago, was now open. From the darkness, a sound drifted out, a faint whisper, and then a child's laughter. The laughter was quiet, muffled, yet each note of it burrowed deep into their bones. It was cold, devoid of joy, artificial, as if mimicked by something that had long forgotten what real human emotions sounded like. Ryu, Saori, and Tomo stood frozen. The flashlight in Ryu's hand trembled. Did you hear that?" Saori whispered. Tomo nodded silently. Ryu gripped the camera with both hands, trying to steady the shaking. His instinct screamed, "Run!" But something held him in place. Was it fear, or was it something more? "It's probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't believe his own words. The wind doesn't laugh. The door, which had been firmly shut just moments ago, now gaped open, revealing a black void beyond. A wave of cold air seeped from the darkness. "We're not going in there, right?" Saori's voice was almost pleading. Ryu took a step forward. "We need to check." Tomo grabbed his arm. "We shouldn't." Ryu could feel how cold his skin had become, but he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was small. An old mattress lay directly on the floor, covered in dust and ominous stains. In the corner, a broken toy, a plush bear, torn open, its stuffing spilling out. Tomo followed and stopped dead in his tracks. Oh, God. He was staring at the wall. Ryu raised the flashlight, and he saw it. Scratch marks. Deep grooves left by fingernails carved into the wood in sheer desperation. Among them, crude, shaky kanji scrawled in uneven strokes. Saori stepped closer, reading the words aloud. "She won't let us go. She is waiting. She is hungry." The three of them exchanged uneasy glances. "It's probably just a prank," Ryu said hoarsely. Tomo suddenly gasped. "What?" He stumbled back. Eyes locked on the stuffed bear, Ryu followed his gaze and saw it. The plush toy's head had turned to face them. A soft giggle echoed from the darkness. This time the voice was closer. Ryu's grip on the camera slipped. It fell to the floor, still recording, capturing movement in the room's farthest, darkest corner. Something was emerging. Pale hands, black hair, eyes black as the abyss. She was here, and she was looking right at them. The silence shattered into whispers. They didn't come from one place. They were everywhere, as if the room itself was breathing. Saori stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. "We need to leave. Now." But Ryu couldn't move. His gaze was locked on the corner of the room, where something was shifting. The darkness itself was thickening, taking shape. A woman. She crouched on all fours, her body twisted into an unnatural pose. Pale skin, black hair cascading to the floor, and her eyes, bottomless voids burning with hunger. Suddenly, she jerked forward. Ryu gasped and threw himself back, barely dodging. The camera hit the floor but kept recording. On the screen, her mouth was opening, wider and wider. From her throat came a sound, a grinding screech, something no human should be able to make. Tomo grabbed Ryu's arm. "Run!" They bolted from the room. Saori was ahead, gasping for breath, panic fueling her sprint. But the moment they reached the hallway, every door around them began opening one by one. A loud bang. Another. Something was crawling out from the dark rooms. Hands. Thin, bony, emaciated hands stretching toward them. Saori screamed, but her voice was drowned out by laughter. That same eerie, unnatural laughter. Ryu turned and saw him, the boy. Half of his face was swallowed by shadow, but his eyes, they burned just like hers. He stood at the end of the corridor, smiling. It wasn't a child's smile, it was hungry. "He's not real," Tomo whispered. "That's not a child." Ryu felt it then, something cold against his neck. A breath. He spun around. She was right behind him. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, skeletal fingers reaching for his face. She was too close. Too close. Ryu screamed. The flashlight flickered. For a split second, darkness consumed everything. And when the light returned, Tomo was gone. Only the empty hallway remained, and from deep within the house a whisper echoed over and over again. "She won't let go. She won't let go. She won't let go." "Tomo?" Ryu's voice echoed through the rotting walls of the house. No answer. Saori clutched his arm, her fingers as cold as ice. Where is he? He was just here. The corridor had changed again. The walls had darkened, slick with something damp and sticky. The talismans that once hung on the doors were now shredded, torn apart, their remnants drifting to the floor like dying leaves. Ryu forced himself to focus. He looked down at the camera still strapped around his neck. The camera. It had been recording. With trembling hands, he pressed the playback button. The screen flickered to life. The last recording. The footage played. They were running, shadows stretching behind them. The camera shook. Tomo was still there just seconds ago, and then the frame froze. Tomo stood still. His eyes were wide open, yet he did not move. She was behind him. Her face was too close, too distorted, her mouth gaping in a silent scream. Tomo never even tried to run. His arms hung limply at his sides, and then the footage glitched, and Tomo was gone. The screen went black. "No, no, no, no," Saori whispered. Ryu lifted his head. "We have to find him." Saori shook her head violently. "We need to leave." Ryu clenched his fists. What if he's still alive? What if he's trapped somewhere in this house? Saori's eyes welled with tears. "We're trapped too." Ryu looked around. The hallway was now impossibly long. New doors had appeared where none had been before. They stood ajar, and from within something was watching. Dark figures. The whispers grew louder. "She won't let go. She won't let go." Ryu took a step forward, and Saori screamed. He spun around. She was standing there, trembling, pointing into the darkness. At the end of the corridor, Tomo. He stood motionless. His face was pale, his eyes empty, his mouth opened as if to speak. But no words came. Instead, a thick, black liquid spilled from his lips. Something inside him was whispering. And then Tomo took a step forward. Another. His movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, as if his body no longer belonged to him. "Run!" Saori shrieked. Ryu didn't move, because Tomo's eyes had changed. Something else was inside him now, something hungry. Tomo kept moving forward. His legs twitched, jerking unnaturally, as if invisible strings were yanking him forward. His mouth remained open, thick, black liquid dripping from his lips, mixing with the dust on the floor. Ryu could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Tomo. His voice wavered with fear. No response. Saori tugged at his arm. That's not him. We have to run. Tomo tilted his head sharply, almost mechanically. From deep within his throat, a voice that was not his rasped. Why are you running? You were looking for me. Saori let out a strangled cry, clamping her hands over her ears. Tomo's voice was changing. It was deeper, layered, as though two voices were speaking at once. You all came here, on your own. His fingers twitched violently. He took another step forward. The air thickened. Every breath was harder to take. Tomo lifted his hand, and his fingers convulsed, twisting and breaking inward, as if something inside him was snapping him apart. She is hungry. He smiled, and then his body collapsed, like an empty husk. Something crawled out of him, a black, writhing mass, like a nest of serpents slithered from his mouth, his eyes, every pore in his skin. Tomo's lifeless form crumpled to the floor, and the shadow grew. Then it opened its eyes. Ryu didn't have time to scream. The shadow lunged. Saori grabbed his arm and pulled. They ran. The dark corridor twisted around them. The doors that had been there moments ago vanished. The walls shuddered, squeezing inward. The house was shifting. Alive. Behind them something surged forward, consuming everything in its path. Ryu barely made it to the stairs. They raced downward, not daring to look back. Saori tripped, but Ryu caught her. Behind them something screamed, a shrieking, grinding sound, like metal being torn apart. Something was coming after them. Saori's breath hitched as she spotted the front door. Ryu, the exit! He sprinted after her. They slammed into the door, shoving with all their strength. It didn't budge. No, 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 no! Saori pounded against the wood. Ryu threw his shoulder into it. It didn't move. Behind them, the whispers grew louder. The darkness was closing in, and then Ryu felt something cold on his neck. A hand, frozen, lifeless fingers clamped around his throat. Saori screamed. Ryu struggled, but he couldn't move, and then he heard her, a whisper, rough and rasping, almost gentle. You will stay here forever. The door burst open. Saori fell forward, but Ryu was yanked back. His hands scraped the air just inches from the doorway, but the house wouldn't let him go. Saori's scream tore through the night, and then the door slammed shut in her face. Saori crashed onto the cold asphalt outside the house, her lungs burning from lack of air. She scrambled to her feet instantly and lunged back toward the door. She pounded her fists against the wooden planks, again and again, but they wouldn't budge. The house had taken him. Saori staggered back, gasping for breath. Her hands trembled violently. The doors remained shut, the windows pitch black, as if nothing had happened. Panic surged through her chest. He was just here. Desperation took over. She rushed to one of the windows, pressing her face against the glass, trying to see inside. Only darkness. No one. The house was silent. But something was wrong. Her own reflection in the glass. The beam of her flashlight was not the only source of light. Someone else was inside. Saori froze. In the reflection behind her, inside the house, stood two figures. One was Ryu, but he wasn't moving. His eyes were open, yet lifeless. His body stood like a doll, empty, expressionless. And the other, her. The ghostly woman loomed behind him, head tilted toward his neck. Her pale hands rested over his chest. Her mouth was whispering something into his ear. Saori's breath hitched. Ryu, slowly. His eyes shifted. He was looking directly at her, and then his lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. Not his, not human. He raised his hand and touched the glass from the inside. Saori screamed, stumbling backward. The window shuddered, and then it shattered. Hundreds of shards exploded outward, raining onto the ground. Saori collapsed, shielding her face. When she finally looked up, Ryu was gone. The woman was gone. The window was whole again. The house was silent once more, but Saori knew. She knew that Ryu was still inside, and he was no longer himself. Saori sat on the ground, unable to move. Her mind refused to accept what she had just seen. Ryu was there, but it wasn't him. She clenched her fists, feeling the cold night air prick her skin. The house was silent now, but Saori knew he was still alive. She stood up, legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't go back. The house wouldn't let her leave again. But Ryu. She took a deep breath. I will bring him back. Leaving behind all hesitation, she stepped across the threshold once more. Darkness swallowed her whole. Her flashlight barely pierced the thick, suffocating void. The air inside was still, as if the house itself was waiting for her. Ryu. Her voice was barely a whisper. No answer. She moved forward, every step echoing through the decayed walls. The house had changed. The walls were darker, stripped raw, soaked in something damp. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, rotten, as if she was walking on something that had been decaying for years. She heard breathing, not hers. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless, Ryu, or what was left of him. He faced the darkness, his head slightly tilted to the side, arms hanging limply by his sides. Ryu, she whispered. No response. She took a step closer. The floor groaned beneath her weight. Ryu's head slowly turned toward her. His eyes were empty. His lips curled into a slow, lifeless smile. You came back. His voice was dry, hollow. Saori's chest tightened with fear. We need to go. Ryu stared at her without blinking, and then he lunged forward. Saori gasped, stumbling back. Why are you running? He whispered. His voice was wrong. Something else was inside him. Something spoke with him. Saori clenched her fists. Ryu, if you're still in there, fight it. His body twitched. His neck bent at an unnatural angle, as if something inside him was breaking him apart. She won't let go. She is hungry. The darkness behind him moved. She emerged, the woman with long black hair, pale skin, her mouth opening, wider and wider. Saori grabbed Ryu's arm. No! She doesn't own you. You're Ryu. You're still you. His skin was ice cold. His body trembled. For a single moment, his eyes changed. They were his again. Saori, he whispered. Her heart pounded. He was still there, but the woman's hands were already wrapping around his shoulders. She was pulling him back. Saori screamed, trying to hold on to him. Ryu! His eyes suddenly widened. His trance snapped. "Go!" he shouted. "Run!" Saori sobbed, refusing to let go. "I won't leave you!" His hands shoved her backward. She fell, and in that last moment, she saw the darkness consume him completely. His face disappeared, and with it, his voice. The doors behind Saori burst open on their own. She scrambled to her feet, ran for her life, and escaped into the night. She turned back. The house was dark, silent, waiting, but this time, Saori knew it was watching her. It would never let her go, because a part of her had stayed behind, with him, and if she ever came back, it would be waiting. It would be hungry. "Ryu," she whispered through her tears. The darkness in the windows seemed to shift. But there was no answer. She would never see him again, or she would, when the house called her back, the end.